I can still see the way my shoulders tense up when someone casually brings up money around the dinner table or in a group conversation. It's this subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but inside, I'm scrambling to think of a way out. Any distraction, any laughter that could wipe away the weight settling somewhere deep in my chest. I never say it out loud, but there's this silent companion I carry everywhere: shame. Not just about numbers on a bank statement or bills piling up on my desk, but a shame so quiet and profound it feels like a shadow that follows me, making even the simplest talk about money feel like a battle I'm destined to lose. It wasn't always this way. I remember once, maybe years ago, when money seemed like a promise of freedom, of possibility. But somewhere along the road, that promise got twisted. Now, instead of hope, it feels like there's this invisible wall between me and everyone else, a divide marked by all the things I'm afraid to admit: the missed payments, the no to social invitations, the avoided calls from credit collectors. Each moment where I've chosen silence over truth has carved deeper grooves of loneliness and defeat. What's hard is not just the numbers or the stress. They're like symptoms. The real pain is in the way this quiet shame seeps into everything. When friends casually talk about their latest investments or new purchases, I smile, nod, maybe even change the topic, but inside, I'm shrinking. It's an old voice in my head, whispering that I don't deserve these things, that I'm behind, that everyone else somehow has it figured out while I'm stuck trying to hold on. The weight of this secret makes me avoid learning more about money, to stay frozen rather than face what feels like inevitable failure. Sometimes, I catch myself thinking, why bother trying? What's the point if I just mess it up again? That small voice grows louder when I'm overwhelmed, telling me it's safer to hide, to accept less, to stay quiet. There's this exhausting cycle where my feelings of shame feed a deep fear of taking risks, and that fear only adds to my financial struggles. It's like I'm caught in quicksand, each attempt to move forward just pulling me deeper into the same old patterns. I've watched others around me move ahead, whether it's a friend's promotion, a family member buying a home, or even a colleague's side hustle growing. And instead of feeling inspired, I'm often consumed by a sense of falling behind, as if my worth is tied to these milestones I haven't reached. It's a heavy truth to admit, but there it is. I feel left out of something essential, as if prosperity isn't just about money but about belonging. And in this silence, that gap grows wider. Yet, despite all the discomfort, there's a part of me that's tired of hiding. The part that wants to stop smiling when money comes up and instead feel confident to face it head on. I'm starting to realize that a lot of what I've been carrying isn't about the money itself, but about a story I've been telling myself. One that makes me the villain in my own financial journey. This story has shaped my choices and held me back more than any external circumstance ever could. I know now that I'm not alone in this. Many of us wrestle with this invisible burden, this quiet shame that blocks us from moving forward. I'm beginning to understand that the path to change isn't just about balancing numbers or budgeting better. It's about looking deeper into the emotional patterns that have been written into my relationship with money, even if that means facing the vulnerability I've been avoiding for so long. The truth is, this isn't just about fixing my finances. It's about reclaiming my sense of self and worth. It's about breaking the silence and lifting the weight of shame that no one talks about, but so many of us carry. What if the journey ahead could help me see money, not as an enemy or a source of shame, but as a mirror reflecting my own story, one I have the power to rewrite? I don't have all the answers yet. What I do have is a readiness to understand myself better, to follow the tangled thread of this shame and discover what lies beneath. I want to find a way out of this cycle, not just to survive, but to build a life where money feels like a tool for growth, not a trap for failure. So, if you've ever felt this too, the urge to look away when finances come up, the weight of unspoken fears, the sting of comparing your progress to others, then maybe this story is for us. Together, we can begin to unravel the hidden truths that keep us stuck and move toward a place where prosperity starts with healing inside. It won't be easy. It won't happen overnight. But something inside tells me that by facing this sooner rather than later, we might just find a freedom we didn't realize was possible. I remember the first time I noticed my hesitation around discussing finances wasn't merely a reluctance to share numbers, but a reluctance to expose a deeper vulnerability. At a family gathering, when someone brought up investments, my gaze dropped to the floor and I forced a smile. My words stumbled, betraying my discomfort. That moment stayed with me, not because of what was said, but because of what I was hiding. It was as if revealing my financial struggles would unravel a part of my identity I'd worked so hard to conceal. This wasn't simply shyness. It was a protective shield forged over years, molded by fear and self-judgment. Digging further, I realized that this silent barrier had a name: avoidance. I had become an expert at sidestepping any conversation or decision that nudged me closer to confronting my reality. When bills arrived, instead of opening them immediately, I pushed them aside, willing them to disappear beneath cluttered piles on my desk. It was easier to live in denial than to face the anxiety that surged in those moments. Paradoxically, my avoidance warped time. I convinced myself that tomorrow's act of opening a statement would be smoother, but tomorrow transformed into weeks. The longer I delayed, the steeper the mountain seemed to climb, reinforcing a sense of powerlessness. Now, consider how this applies when you face sudden financial surprises. I used to think that ignoring an unexpected expense might somehow fix the problem on its own, but reality offered a harsh lesson. When my car unexpectedly broke down, instead of seeking help or budgeting for repairs, I buried my doubts and fears beneath excuses and distractions. Days later, when the mechanic's text arrived, my body recoiled. Rather than scheduling the repair immediately, I procrastinated, pretending the problem would resolve itself. This inertia only inflated my stress, staining my confidence further and making practical solutions seem unattainable. Another crucial layer is how comparisons creep into our perception of success or failure. Whereas others might stride confidently, celebrating milestones openly, I saw myself through fractured lenses, constantly measuring my value by a shifting standard. I recall scrolling through social media feeds, feeling both awe and a sting of inadequacy watching peers buy homes, take vacations, or launch businesses. The highlight reels felt like distant worlds, intensifying my isolation. Yet, what lay beneath those images were countless uncertainties and struggles rarely spoken aloud. The contrast sharpened my inner critique, transforming admiration into guilt for not measuring up. While reflecting, I unearthed a seldom discussed but destructive companion to shame: secrecy. Concealing financial distress became a habitual dance where openness felt impossible. For years, I didn't share details even with those closest to me, worried I'd become an embarrassment or a burden. I recounted an instance when I lied about why I turned down a lunch invitation, citing a vague headache instead of admitting I couldn't afford it. That moment epitomized how secrecy shaped routines and interactions, channeling a lonely narrative that silently dictated my choices and isolated me emotionally. Interestingly, this secrecy created ripple effects extending beyond individual relationships. I noticed how it influenced my approach to learning about finances. Instead of seeking knowledge or advice, I shrank away from resources, workshops, or even simple conversations that might illuminate my path. A fear lingered. What if delving deeper only exposed my missteps more starkly? I felt trapped by the false belief that ignorance might shield me from further shame. Ironically, this mindset stunted growth and chipped away at emerging sparks of courage, making financial literacy seem like a privilege reserved for others. One afternoon, a turning point emerged unexpectedly. I was scrolling through a community message board when a thread caught my attention, a group speaking candidly about their financial pitfalls without judgment. Hesitant, I read comment after comment filled with empathy, practical advice, and stories mirroring my own struggles. Their openness cracked open something in me, a yearning to dismantle the fortress I'd built around these topics. It was a small, quiet shift, but significant, a seed of possibility that suggested connection and learning could replace isolation and fear. With this newfound perspective, I started experimenting with vulnerability in safe spaces. I rehearsed sharing modest details during casual chats or asking for recommendations on budgeting tools without the usual anxiety. Each small conversation chipped away at old habits, revealing fresh pathways. These exchanges illuminated how conversations about money don't have to be battlegrounds or shameful confessions. They could be stepping stones toward understanding and empowerment. This journey also revealed the paradox of control. I realized that clinging tightly to avoidance and silence wasn't protection. It was surrendering my power to ghostly fears. Yet, embracing uncertainty became a radical act of reclaiming agency. By choosing to face discomfort rather than evade it, I began rewriting the internal narrative, a testament to resilience rather than submission. It's as if I was learning to navigate foggy terrain, trusting that each deliberate, uncertain step forward would gradually clear the path. At the core of this experience lies an invitation to reevaluate what it means to engage with our financial realities authentically. When we relinquish the urge to conceal our struggles, a profound space opens for growth and healing. This unmasking is not about announcing defeats or seeking validation. Instead, it's about acknowledging our humanity within the economic challenges we face. Over time, I sensed that transparency, even in small doses, could weaken the grip shame holds, paving the way for practical change infused with self-compassion. Reflecting on these moments has deepened my understanding that financial avoidance, fueled by silence and secrecy, is more than a habit. It is a subtle captivity. And only by gently stepping into discomfort, weaving connection with others who mirror our vulnerabilities, can we start breaking free. This isn't a neat or instantaneous process. It's a winding path that calls for patience and courage, but one that gradually leads us toward reclaiming a dignified, hopeful relationship with financial life. I can still remember the exact moment when I realized how deeply intertwined my sense of self was with the finances I kept hidden from view. It happened during a quiet late evening, alone in my small apartment. The glow from my laptop screen illuminated piles of unopened bills scattered carelessly across the cluttered table. As I sat there, palms sweating and heart pounding, I suddenly recognized that my avoidance wasn't solely born from fear of scarcity, but from an unspoken narrative that had shaped my identity for years. The story whispered that I was incompetent, unreliable, and destined to fall short. It was staggering to feel how much this invisible manuscript influenced the decisions I made, or avoided making, in daily life. What struck me further was the realization that this script extended far beyond my financial realm. It seeped into my relationships, my career, even my self-perception. I remember skipping invitations to gatherings, fearing conversations I couldn't evade would lead to questions I couldn't answer. When a friend asked casually, "How's everything going financially?" my pulse would quicken. Instead of sharing honestly, I'd murmur vague reassurances, playing the role of someone holding it together while inside I crumbled. This self-imposed isolation deepened the chasms between me and others, intensifying feelings of alienation and fueling the internal accusations that I was inferior. One afternoon, my resolve was tested in a way I hadn't anticipated. Walking through a crowded shopping district, I overheard a pair of strangers animatedly chatting nearby about a recent investment triumph. Their light-hearted laughter revealed a confidence I envied but felt I could never attain. That moment weighed heavily on me, not because I wished harm or envy upon them, but because it exposed the scarcity mindset entrenched deep in my psyche. It dawned on me that beyond economics, my struggle revolved around acceptance of mistakes, of imperfection, of my right to prosper without shame or hesitation. It was a revelation that made me question how many more opportunities had slipped away while I battled my inner critic. Even as these insights unfolded, I noticed how my financial hesitation was often tangled with a complex fear of judgment masquerading as pragmatism. For instance, I found myself refusing to ask for help or seek guidance, convincing myself it was a matter of independence or prudence. I recall vividly declining free financial counseling offered through a community center, telling the volunteer a polite, "I'm fine," while my chest tightened. Beneath that polite refusal, there lurked a storm of humiliation and distrust. Fears that exposing my difficulties might paint me as weak or irresponsible. Each refusal built another brick in the walls I had constructed, isolating me further and stalling progress that could have been made with a little support. A particularly vivid memory comes to mind from a conversation with my younger cousin. She was discussing her plans to start saving for a new venture, excitedly sharing her spreadsheets and goals. Despite my own reservations, I invited her to help me craft a basic budget, thinking that maybe, through her enthusiasm, I might find a spark to rekindle my own motivation. She patiently guided me through the process, but when numbers on the screen started showing uncomfortable truths, I panicked. Maybe this isn't for me, I whispered, feeling vulnerable and defeated. Yet, her gentle encouragement reminded me that financial growth doesn't require perfection. It demands persistence and kindness toward oneself. This exchange planted an unexpected seed. That vulnerability might not be my enemy, but a doorway to transformation. What's remained constant throughout these episodes is the subtle dance between hope and hesitation. Hope whispers promises of what could be, a life where financial strain doesn't dictate my worth. Hesitation, however, stands guard like an old sentinel, casting doubts on every step I attempt. These opposing forces often leave me suspended in a liminal space, aching to move forward but burdened by inertia. More than once, I've caught myself drafting letters of intent or signing up for courses, only to retreat and dismiss those efforts as futile. Each retreat reminds me that my obstacles are emotional as much as they are practical, shaped by narratives that require more than logic to dismantle. In the midst of this tension, a breakthrough emerged when I finally decided to journal. Not the typical budget notes or expense lists, but my true feelings and fears tied to financial challenges. Writing compelled me to confront a kaleidoscope of emotions: disappointment, embarrassment, hope, and the quiet courage I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. The act of putting pen to paper wove together threads I hadn't realized were fraying. It opened up cracks through which light and empathy slowly seeped, lighting a path away from silence. The process wasn't comfortable. In fact, it was raw and taxing. Yet, every page affirmed that my story was changing, gradually replacing constraining shame with authentic voices of ambition and resilience. One night, sitting with my journal beside a half-empty cup of cold tea, I wrote this line: "My financial narrative no longer defines my value, but invites me to grow." That simple sentence felt revolutionary. I realized that by naming my struggles openly, I reclaimed space to imagine a future untethered from passive despair. I understood that the journey ahead wouldn't be linear or easy, but it was mine to walk, with courage, support, and patience. At that moment, the invisible chains began loosening, and an inner doorway creaked open to fresh possibilities I once believed were beyond my reach. The first time I noticed how deeply my emotions were intertwined with my financial choices was during a morning at the local cafe. I sat there, stirring my cold coffee, as a fellow patron animatedly shared how he had taken a calculated risk with his savings and reaped unexpected rewards. I listened, but beneath his enthusiasm simmered my own hesitation, not a lack of desire, but an internal voice telling me that excitement could only lead to disappointment. It was as if I carried an internal blueprint, etched over time, that defined finance as a minefield where mistakes weren't just setbacks but personal failures. The irony struck me. While his narrative celebrated action, mine had been quietly frozen by past missteps. That day, I realized how my decisions were less about external conditions and more about the stories I repeated when confronted with opportunity. I recalled earlier instances where invitations to invest or save sparked avoidance instead of curiosity. A friend once offered to teach me about a promising new budgeting app, but when she asked if I wanted her to set it up with me, I hesitated and invented a vague excuse. Beneath that excuse lay a dread of exposure, fear that revealing my lack of financial confidence would reinforce the shame I clung to daily. It dawned on me that my avoidance was not about the tools or knowledge themselves, but about the threat they posed to my self-image. In the weeks that followed, I began peeling back layers I had unconsciously placed between myself and my economic reality. I recognized how my past experiences shaped a small but potent self-narrative. I'm someone who always messes up with finances. Despite occasional successes, this simple mantra eclipsed my view, acting like a filter that turned all efforts into failures before they began. It was a fog that blurred possibilities and redirected my energy towards safety instead of growth. The realization shifted my awareness from external problems to internal barriers, fostering a new kind of responsibility, not for what had happened, but for how I interpreted it. As I explored this inner landscape, an unexpected metaphor emerged: I pictured myself as a gardener reluctant to tend a once barren patch because I had convinced myself the soil was dead. Instead of fostering growth, I'd been avoiding the land, fearing the humiliation of failed seeds. However, the truth lay in understanding that neglect had hardened the earth. It wasn't barren. It was waiting for new care. The choice to engage, even with uncertainty, could till the soil and nourish fresh beginnings. This metaphor reframed my relationship with financial healing, transforming it from a judgment-filled obstacle into a terrain ripe with potential. Around this time, I noticed how my body also echoed my emotional resistance. When bills arrived or budgets needed adjustment, I experienced a physical tightening, an almost visceral reaction likened to a shrinking chest and shallow breaths. This pattern underscored the somatic dimension of my struggles. My body remembered the shame and fear before my mind could rationalize or avoid. Understanding that these physiological responses fed my emotional paralysis was empowering. It nudged me to experiment with mindful breathing and grounding techniques in those moments, small acts that slowly retrained my nervous system's alarms and opened subtle spaces for contemplation instead of retreat. One afternoon, a particularly vivid illustration of my internal conflict surfaced during a budgeting workshop I reluctantly attended. As the instructor walked us through planning strategies, I found myself oscillating between eagerness and skepticism. When asked to share my goals with a peer, my voice faltered. I confessed quietly, I want to feel like I'm in control, but I'm afraid to fail again. Hearing the words aloud sparked an unexpected connection with the group. Others nodded, shared their own doubts. This collective vulnerability cracked the rigid mask I'd worn, proving that my fears were far from unique. Those moments revealed how community can become a balm for wounds we thought had to remain hidden. Simultaneously, I confronted how avoidance had derailed my financial path in less obvious ways. For instance, I realized that my habit of dodging discussions about money had caused me to miss opportunities, whether it was a promotion, a networking chance, or even better terms on a loan. The cost was not solely monetary, but emotional, as fear-funded inertia limited my growth and seeded a sense of disconnection from my own ambitions. By naming these subtle losses, I reclaimed awareness about how self-limiting patterns could quietly reshape entire trajectories. Throughout this unfolding awareness, I observed another dynamic at play, my tendency to dichotomize. I often saw financial success as an all-or-nothing game, where a single misstep meant ruin. This black-and-white thinking heightened my anxiety and fueled the internal dialogue discouraging experimentation. Challenging this mindset became another pivotal step. I started recognizing that incremental progress, even with bumps along the way, was valuable growth, not failure. Understanding that imperfection is part of the journey softened my approach and allowed me to view my financial story as evolving rather than fixed. These insights gradually built a foundation for new habits. Rather than shutting down or deflecting, I consciously paused when discomfort arose, naming the emotions without judgment. I began keeping a journal where I recorded not only expenses but emotional reflections connected to financial decisions, an unfolding dialogue with myself. Sometimes, I wrote about frustration. Other times, gratitude for small wins appeared unexpectedly. This practice cultivated a compassionate awareness that reframed my relationship with money from adversary to teacher. One evening, after months of these efforts, I sat by the window watching the city lights shimmer against a dark sky. I realized I was no longer shrinking when financial themes floated into my thoughts. Instead, I felt a cautious curiosity, a willingness to engage with uncertainty. That shift wasn't dramatic or spectacular, but deeply meaningful. It felt like stepping through a previously locked door, where the silence was replaced by possibility. Though the journey continued, I sensed the empowering truth. Liberation begins when we learn to face, rather than flee from, the feelings entwined with our financial realities. I never anticipated how much silence could carry weight until I faced a family reunion where financial talk was unavoidable. The clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter filled the air, yet beneath it, whispers and subtle glances stirred discomfort inside me. When an uncle enthusiastically detailed his latest business venture, I found myself retreating inward, heart pounding like a drum. The contrast between his confident words and my own guarded silence felt like a chasm widening between us, one I feared might never be bridged. I gripped my cup tighter, cheeks flushing, not because of embarrassment alone, but due to a gnawing fear of being judged unworthy or incapable. This evening etched a fresh understanding of how shame can serve as an invisible prison, shaping not only what I chose to share, but also how I shaped my sense of belonging. I sensed how the invisible boundary I erected isolated me, creating an emotional exile in the room full of familiar faces. Isolation often disguises itself in smiles and nods, but inside, I was waging a lonely battle to keep vulnerability at bay. It dawned on me that avoidance extended into detailed aspects, like declining to negotiate bills or putting off asking questions that might feel invasive or threatening. This compulsion to hide became a survival mechanism that ironically pushed me further away from support and shared wisdom. One afternoon, during an informal chat with a close friend, I blurted out, "I'm tired of pretending I've got it all figured out." The admission hung heavily in the air, but her response surprised me. Instead of distancing herself, she shared her own financial missteps with candid humor. That exchange shattered my illusion that I was alone in my struggles. Before, I had harbored a belief that admitting weakness was equivalent to failure. Now, I glimpsed how vulnerability could be a bridge rather than a barrier. Our conversation painted a different narrative, where openness could plant seeds of connection and healing. It was like stepping from a shadow into sunlight, a light I had feared might burn instead of warm. The shadows, however, did not dissipate instantly. I grappled with internal voices that cast past mistakes as permanent stains on my character. For example, I found any looming financial decision would trigger a flood of second-guessing, as if my prior errors had rendered me untrustworthy to myself. This self-doubt was a sly saboteur, eroding confidence and fueling procrastination. In one case, when offered a part-time freelance opportunity, I hesitated so long that the invitation passed. Instead of celebrating it as a chance to rebuild, I spiraled into what-ifs, imagining rejection, shame, and further disappointment. The paralysis felt suffocating, a thick fog that dulled even the faintest spark of motivation. Complex emotions often intertwined beneath my surface. For instance, frustration mixed with guilt. I blamed myself for not doing enough. Yet beneath that blame rested exhaustion from carrying invisible burdens. The weight of unspoken expectations, both self-imposed and external, felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. Each step brought discomfort, but the decision to take the shoes off exposed vulnerability I wasn't yet ready to confront openly. This tension fostered a relentless internal dialogue that circled like a storm, incessantly questioning worthiness and potential. Sometimes, I wished I could mute that conversation altogether. Unexpectedly, a simple ritual introduced a calming rhythm into this chaos. I started carving out 5 minutes daily to close my eyes and focus on my breath. Initially, the silence amplified discomfort, a mirror reflecting restless thoughts and anxieties. Yet, gradually, those few moments became pockets of grace. With each inhalation, tension loosened like tightly knotted ropes untying. One evening, enveloped in that quiet, an unexpected thought emerged. Perhaps I could approach my finances not as an adversary demanding perfection, but as a reflection of my evolving story. Despite the flaws, the hesitations, there was room for progress, growth, and even kindness toward myself. This practice also nudged me into observing triggers without immediately reacting. When a payment reminder popped up on my phone, instead of recoiling, I noticed the familiar squeeze in my chest and named it, not as failure, but as a signal. This subtle shift opened space to plan calmly rather than retreat, a choice to break the automatic flight response. I began setting incremental goals, like responding to overdue notices within 24 hours or asking a trusted advisor for clarity on confusing statements. These small victories piled up slowly but reliably, building a foundation stronger than any fleeting motivation. One afternoon, I walked into a bustling marketplace and observed a young entrepreneur confidently navigating customers despite uncertainties and mistakes. Watching her, I realized resilience wasn't the absence of fear, but the courage to face it again and again. Her journey mirrored the one I was beginning to accept. Setbacks woven with forward steps, courage expressed in persistence. That realization untangled some of the guilt I'd held onto, reminding me that grace lives not in perfection, but in compassionate persistence. Our inner landscapes are sometimes shaped by forces beyond our immediate awareness. I began exploring how past messages, subtle tones from childhood, societal narratives about success and failure, had sculpted my beliefs about worth and financial capability. Recognizing that I inherited scripts that didn't serve me was liberating. It meant I wasn't chained to old identities, but entrusted with the power to author new ones. This insight fueled a growing curiosity. What if the shame was not a verdict, but a misplaced emotion yearning for understanding? What if beneath the heavy curtain of silent suffering lay a path to empowerment waiting patiently? Each new discovery carved a small opening in a fortress built to protect a frightened self. As these openings multiplied, so did a capacity to lean into discomfort and transform it, turning inward anguish into invitations for growth. The process felt less like battling demons and more like learning to dance with shadows, acknowledging their presence but refusing to be defined by them. The courage to endure the sting of shame without fleeing carved a space where healing could quietly begin. I remember the moment I hesitated to check a notification on my phone, sensing an invisible force pressing against my chest. It was a message from my bank, the type that could have led me to confront overdue payments or account discrepancies. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, caught in a swirl of emotions I hadn't fully named before: dread, embarrassment, and an almost physical recoil. This wasn't mere procrastination. It felt like my mind was barricading itself from truths that threatened to shatter the fragile facade I'd erected. The irony struck me. My aversion didn't protect me, but imprisoned me, deepening a chasm I longed to close but feared to approach. That evening, flickering candlelight casting shadows on my walls, I unearthed a new awareness. My self-imposed exile was not solely about shame, but also about an undeclared mistrust. Mistrust in my ability to repair past mistakes, and mistrust in a future that felt uncertain and hostile. Beneath this, I sensed a profound need for acceptance, not just from others, but from myself. For over time, I had learned to hide imperfections, rehearsing smiles that masked the turmoil beneath. Yet that night, silence begged for honesty. It dawned on me that true healing demanded I welcome discomfort as a messenger rather than an enemy. The next day, I ventured to open that message. The simple act triggered a cascade of thoughts, memories, like opening a dusty photo album long ignored. The figures on the screen weren't just numbers. They told a story of missed chances, of battles fought in loneliness and quiet desperation. My fingers trembled as I balanced emotions that pulled me between despair and hope. It was encouraging to discover that while the tasks ahead were daunting, they were not insurmountable. This reckoning brought a renewed vigor, compelling me to draft an honest inventory, acknowledging debts not as failures etched into my identity, but as challenges demanding patient, steady response. Later that week, during a community workshop focusing on financial empowerment, I encountered voices that echoed my own fears and doubts, but also radiated strength forged in adversity. One woman shared how she confronted her accumulated credit card debts by taking it step by step, allocating small, manageable payments rather than chasing impossible perfection. Her story lingered with me like a beacon. I understood then that the script I carried was not fate written in stone. It was a dialogue open to revision. Hearing others' narratives shattered the illusion that I was singularly burdened, replacing isolation with solidarity. Yet, another layer emerged: the struggle to reconcile self-compassion with accountability. I wrestled with a harsh internal critic that demanded instant fixes and punished hesitation. This inner voice often chastised me for past choices, reinforcing a loop of self-reproach that made every financial setback feel like personal defeat. In response, I began practicing deliberate kindness toward myself. Small gestures like celebrating a bill paid on time or forgiving a misstep without harsh judgment. This shift transformed internal chatter from a relentless drill sergeant into a patient coach, reminding me that we progress through rhythm, not leaps. One quiet evening illustrated this transformation vividly. I sat with a pen and notebook, wrestling with a budget I deemed inadequate. Frustration bubbled inside as expenses seemed to outpace income. Suddenly, I caught myself murmuring, "This is my starting line, not my finish." The words surprised me, an anthem of beginnings rather than endings. I allowed space for imperfections, recognizing that stability would not dawn overnight, but evolve through consistent effort and grace. Accepting this gentle patience became a balm, quieting the urge for unconscious sabotage. Beyond numbers and plans, I confronted how deeply my sense of identity was entwined with financial self-worth. I recalled moments when a declined invitation to dinner weighed heavier than any invoice. Social withdrawal was a camouflage to shield me from perceived judgment, but it cost me connection, laughter, and opportunities. Recognizing this, I resolved to embrace vulnerability incrementally, sometimes by sharing a small truth with trusted friends or by attending gatherings without the emotional armor I once considered essential. With each act, I discovered layers of freedom and belonging previously obscured by fear. A few days later, reflecting in a sunlit park surrounded by autumn leaves, I embraced the metaphor of seasons and healing. Just as trees shed leaves to conserve energy for growth, I could release my own burdens, not by forcing sudden change, but by honoring rhythms suitable for me. This meant celebrating moments of rest and acceptance alongside action. Nourishing curiosity replaced judgment, and through this, a quiet power stirred within, a promise that change was possible through persistent presence. That afternoon, as a soft breeze whispered through branches overhead, I recognized the profound lesson. Resilience is not an indictment of invincibility, but a willingness to face uncertainty with courage. It's a dance between strength and fragility, progress and setback. In this dance, I discovered a new posture, one that embraced imperfection as fertile ground for transformation. This insight reshaped my mindset from fearful avoidance to courageous engagement, inviting a future where I could author my financial story with authenticity and hope. I remember the day I stumbled upon an old shoebox tucked away in the back of my closet, filled with forgotten receipts, crumpled pay stubs, and faded bank statements. As I sifted through the paper relics of my past, an unexpected kaleidoscope of emotions swirled inside me. Nostalgia, regret, but also a curious sense of history, an archive of choices made, some conscious, many driven by feelings I hadn't yet untangled. It struck me how these artifacts weren't mere records of transactions, but pages from an unfolding personal saga. This realization challenged the silent narrative I'd carried, suggesting that my financial story was less an unchangeable script and more a patchwork quilt, stitched together by moments both bright and shadowed. That moment of discovery nudged me toward exploring the power of narrative reframing. I started to see that embracing the full scope of my financial past, even the messy, uncomfortable parts, could open portals to new meanings. Instead of labeling old mistakes as failures etched into my identity, I began to view them as chapters rich with lessons and insight. This shift was akin to reading a novel from a fresh angle. Characters' flaws no longer tragically defined them, but illuminated the contours of their growth. It was as if I was granted permission to become both author and editor of my unfolding money story, crafting hope where despair had settled. Shortly thereafter, a conversation with a mentor deepened this perspective. She shared how her own fiscal struggles had been riddled with bouts of self-doubt and impulsivity, yet those experiences didn't chain her. They informed her resilience. "The past you're inclined to judge is a reference point, not a prison," she said softly during our talk. Her words resonated with a quiet conviction that I clung to. They sparked vivid imagery. A river may carry debris downstream, yet it flows onward, reshaping landscapes and nurturing new life. I found myself inspired to treat my financial memories less like burdens and more like seeds, carefully planted to yield growth. Meanwhile, I noticed how my internal dialogue played a starring role in steering decisions. Whenever I caught myself murmuring limiting beliefs, phrases like, "I'm not cut out for this," or "I always screw things up," I paused, recognizing the toxic script beneath. Experimenting with alternative self-talk became a subtle, yet transformative practice. When anxiety about budgeting crept in, I replaced self-criticism with affirmations of experimentation and learning. For example, I started saying, I'm discovering steps that work uniquely for me, turning fear of failure into an invitation for curiosity. This nuanced language rewired my mental pathways gradually, loosening the grip of stagnation. Around this transitional period, I encountered a metaphor that felt particularly vivid. I imagined my financial patterns as an ancient tree with tangled roots sprawling beneath the soil. The branches above represented visible actions, spending habits, savings, investment choices, while the roots symbolized subconscious beliefs and emotions hidden from plain sight. To nurture healthier growth, tending the roots was indispensable. This image urged me to cultivate patience and attentiveness, understanding that superficial fixes might only mask deeper blockages. Carefully questioning long-held assumptions became a daily ritual, like delicately unraveling knotted threads to reveal vibrant fibers beneath. This deeper cultivation also brought me into contact with the paradox of control. At times, I clung tightly to rigid budgets or rigid avoidance, convinced either would shield me from chaos or shame. However, I learned that surrendering the illusion of absolute control created fertile ground for empowerment. By embracing uncertainty and imperfection, I opened space for flexible strategies that better aligned with my emotional rhythms. For instance, rather than rigidly cutting every expense, I allocated small allowances for joy or learning, which paradoxically strengthened my discipline instead of undermining it. This balance between structure and adaptability became a cornerstone of my evolving approach. Around that same time, I began engaging with financial mentorship circles, small groups where candid vulnerabilities were met with empathy and practical wisdom. These gatherings dismantled isolation and offered real-life reflections. A solo parent mastering debt consolidation, a young artist simultaneously navigating gigs and budgets, a retiree untangling decades-old money misunderstandings. Listening to their stories, I felt inspired by the mosaic of human experience behind financial challenges. Our exchanges felt less like lectures and more like shared explorations through complex terrain, each participant holding a lantern for the others. This community became a reservoir of encouragement during moments I felt tempted to retreat. Creating a visual map of my financial emotions emerged as another powerful tool. I spent hours sketching circles and lines, labeling them with descriptors like fear of scarcity, hope for security, guilt over past mistakes, and desire for freedom. Placing these elements in relation to each other helped untangle how some feelings fueled others, how guilt could spiral into avoidance, or how hope could fuel bravery despite uncertainty. This cartography offered me an intuitive guide, a way to trace emotional currents and intervene with compassion or strategy when turbulence arose. One striking encounter deepened this emotional cartography. During a workshop on behavioral finance, a facilitator posed a simple question: what does your financial fear look like as a shape or color? I was startled by the vividness of the vision that emerged, dark, jagged shards crisscrossed with flickers of warm amber. Sharing this imagery with the group evoked reflections of shared human vulnerability and the power to transform shadows into light. That exercise taught me to meet my fears as parts of myself deserving attention, not enemies to expel. In weaving together these new insights, I found that allowing myself to dwell in complexity, embracing contradictory emotions, unexpected discoveries, and imperfect progress, filled my financial story with richness and depth. This emerging tapestry felt less like a battle or burden and more like an evolving work of art, an invitation to create, heal, and flourish beyond previous boundaries. I can't forget the afternoon I sat across from my grandfather, listening to him recount his long history working with numbers and budgets. His eyes twinkled as he told stories of resourcefulness during lean times, but I noticed how quietly he emphasized the mistakes he had made along the way. You learn through trial, he said softly, and you have to make peace with when things don't pan out. His voice carried a weight of acceptance I hadn't encountered before, as if the struggles weren't stains on his character but badges of lived experience. That conversation planted a seed of curiosity in me. What if mistakes were not failures, but markers on a path I hadn't yet traveled? Not long after, I faced a situation that forced me to test this idea. When I was unexpectedly hit with a large medical bill, my instinct was to withdraw, hide it under a mound of excuses and silence. But I imagined my grandfather's calm, steady approach and decided to confront it head-on. I contacted the billing department, admitted my situation honestly, and asked if there were payment options available. To my surprise, they offered a manageable installment plan, which felt like a lifeline rather than a burden. That small act of communication cracked open a door I had kept shut for years and proved that vulnerability could create connection instead of shame. As I continued on this path, I began to recognize the role that deeply ingrained perfectionism played in my financial hesitation. I had always believed that managing money required a flawless track record or airtight plans. But real life rarely offers such clarity or certainty. I noticed similar patterns emerging when I procrastinated on creating a budget, telling myself that unless every calculation was exact, it wasn't worth starting. It reminded me of standing at the edge of a foggy forest, overwhelmed by uncertainty about which trail to take, paralyzed by the fear of wrong turns. Eventually, I learned to embrace exploration, taking small, imperfect steps into the unknown rather than waiting for ideal conditions that never arrived. An invitation to a community workshop on emotional intelligence became another pivotal point. The facilitator guided us through exercises focused on identifying hidden feelings attached to our finances: resentment, fear, guilt. During one exercise, I reflected on how I'd internalized a critical inner voice that often whispered I wasn't smart enough to succeed financially. I realized I had rarely stopped to challenge that voice's harsh verdicts. As I began acknowledging and humanizing these internal critics, they gradually lost their grip. It was like shining a light into dark corners of a room. Suddenly, the shadows receded, and I could see the objects clearly instead of fearing what lurked unseen. There was also a revelation about how I'd unconsciously used busyness as a shield against reflection. I kept overly preoccupied with daily tasks, not to distract, but to prevent myself from reckoning with uncomfortable financial truths. I recall evenings where exhaustion was my companion, a heavy fog that spared me the agony of self-examination. Slowly, I discovered that cultivating mindful pauses, moments when I sat quietly with my thoughts without rushing ahead, helped me notice recurring patterns. These intervals became oases where patience grew and insight had room to flourish, teaching me that deliberate stillness can foster profound internal shifts. In one vivid moment, I sat by the window watching rain cascade, each drop tracing a unique path down the glass. Nature's unhurried rhythm revealed a metaphor I hadn't noticed. Growth does not demand sudden storms, but rather steady nourishment through cycles of rest and renewal. This perspective softened my resistance towards setbacks. I learned that setbacks were not signs of failure, but integral parts of a more extensive process, much like how seasons gently reshuffle landscapes. Embracing this cyclical truth nurtured resilience and reframed my relationship with progress. Amid these changes, I began nurturing a more compassionate inner dialogue, reminiscent of speaking to a close friend rather than a stern disciplinarian. When I stumbled, my mental narrative shifted from harsh criticism to gentle encouragement. It's okay to stumble. Each effort counts. This transformation didn't erase challenges, but made them less daunting, like walking a path where reassuring hands guided me over rough terrain. With this newfound kindness, I felt empowered to explore financial education, not as a judgment-filled task, but as an invitation to discover tools aligned with my unique story. Eventually, I decided to track not only expenses, but also my emotional responses tied to spending and saving. Recording feelings alongside numbers unveiled that impulsive purchases often followed moments of stress or loneliness, while disciplined saving brought sparks of pride and calm. This record-keeping became a personal compass, helping me respond more thoughtfully to triggers and celebrate mindful choices, unfolding layers of self-awareness I hadn't accessed before. During a heartfelt conversation with a friend who had navigated similar challenges, we exchanged stories of struggle and breakthrough. Her account of shifting from scarcity-focused thinking to a mindset of abundance felt reassuring, a reminder that transformation is possible in unexpected ways. Hearing her describe how embracing imperfections opened new doors compelled me to envision my own journey, as one of continual unfolding, no defined destination, but an evolving process rich with possibility and discovery. Reflecting on this journey so far, I find myself standing at a crossroads beneath a sky still tinged with twilight, caught between what was and what could be. The patterns that have shaped me, long concealed beneath layers of silence and hesitation, now ripple beneath the surface like quiet currents pushing against the shore. There is a subtle shift stirring within, a sensation that the walls I've built around my insecurities aren't as impenetrable as they once seemed. It's as if I'm beginning to recognize the delicate threads that tie my inner narrative to the outer world, a complex tapestry woven from whispers of doubt, flashes of hope, and moments of courage that have silently accumulated over time. There's an almost imperceptible tension in this unfolding, a dance between vulnerability and resilience that doesn't demand perfection but invites presence. It's like walking through a dense forest where the path isn't always clear, yet the light filtering through the leaves offers glimpses of what lies ahead. At times, the ground beneath my feet remains uncertain, causing hesitation, but the desire to move forward beats louder than the fear that once held me still. In this space between knowing and becoming, I sense an awakening, a call to embrace complexity without judgment, to meet each internal breeze with openness instead of resistance. I find myself imagining our inner worlds as vast, textured landscapes, terrain marked not solely by obstacles, but by hidden wells of strength and reservoirs of creativity. These environments evolve when tended to with patience and compassion, growing fertile over time. The shadows that once loomed large now invite exploration rather than evasion. Each encounter with discomfort becomes a stepping stone instead of a stumbling block. It reminds me that transformation is not an event, but an artful unfolding, shaped by how we listen, respond, and reimagine the stories we tell ourselves. There's also a curious harmony emerging among the disparate elements that once seemed disconnected, a weaving together of emotion and reason, past and present, fear and aspiration. Like rivers converging into a single current, these aspects create a momentum that carries me beyond old limitations. It's as if the accumulated insights and revelations coalesce into a force both gentle and powerful, urging me to journey deeper into uncharted territories within myself. This convergence doesn't erase the complexities I carry. Instead, it deepens my capacity to navigate them with grace. In moments of stillness, I feel the weight of this inside me, an intricate balance between surrender and agency. The pull to protect and the impulse to grow engage in an ongoing dialogue, neither fully suppressing the other. This nuanced interplay shapes the contours of my evolving self, painting a portrait not bound by past selves, but illuminated by fresh possibilities. The path forward stretches wide, not defined by rigid scripts, but by an openness to discovery and transformation. And as I walk this unfolding path, I realize that the journey holds an invitation, not only to face what has been hidden or feared, but to honor the courage it takes to do so. The layers of silence and shame dissolve slowly as I bring light to what was once shadowed, revealing new dimensions of strength and tenderness nestled side by side. It's an invitation to reclaim a narrative rich with authenticity, one that embraces imperfection and champions the quiet power found in vulnerability. With every step, there is the promise of renewal woven delicately into the fabric of experience, beckoning me onward into a territory where healing and growth entwine. There was a quiet moment recently that lingered with me long after it had passed. I was sitting on a park bench, sunlight dappled through autumn leaves, when a stranger approached and casually mentioned their own financial struggles. Something in the ease of their confession startled me. It struck me how rare it is to encounter such honesty without judgment, a vulnerability that felt both freeing and deeply human. In that brief exchange, I glimpsed a profound truth. The stories we carry about money, shame, and worth are not solitary burdens, but shared threads weaving through our common humanity. Since then, I've come to realize that shame, with all its heaviness, thrives not in the facts themselves, but in the silence we preserve around them. Each unspoken fear and hidden struggle feeds a cycle of isolation that quietly tightens its grip, parsing our confidence into fragile fragments. Yet when we dare to voice these experiences, unvarnished and unafraid, we begin to fracture shame's invisibility. The simple act of presence and acknowledgement can create openings where hope and courage quietly kindle, transforming private pain into collective strength. I remember how long I resisted that kind of openness, tightly clutching my reservations like lifelines. The prospect of exposing vulnerability felt like stepping over a precipice into an abyss of judgment. But over time, I discovered it wasn't falling that defined me. It was my willingness to keep walking despite uncertainty. There have been days when the shadows of doubt and insecurity pressed against my chest, whispering that retreat was safer. Yet, when I met those whispers with a gentle curiosity, the shadows softened. Less opponents, more teachers steering me toward awareness. What surprises me most is that this process is not linear or neat. Healing does not arrive wrapped in tidy packages or instantly wash away pain. Instead, it ebbs and flows like a tide, pulling us into introspection one day and propelling us forward the next. It requires patience, not just the patience to endure setbacks, but the patience to listen kindly to our own fragmented stories and to honor the messy growth that emerges. This unfolding has taught me to appreciate nuance, to hold space simultaneously for disappointment and progress, for wounds and wisdom. In reflecting on this, I've realized how essential it is to reclaim our narratives by acknowledging the parts we've hidden away. When I first began naming my fears aloud, bit by bit, a peculiar kind of lightness followed. It was as if each spoken fear peeled away an invisible layer, releasing me from a prison I'd unknowingly built. That freedom changed how I viewed money itself, not as an enemy or a measuring stick of my value, but as a reflection of my evolving self. This shift opened a pathway where financial life became less about scarcity and judgment and more about curiosity, learning, and growth. I still meet moments when self-doubt creeps back in, sometimes whispering old stories that threaten to trap me again. But now, I greet those moments with a gentler voice rooted not in blame, but in compassion. I remind myself that my worth is not tethered to any ledger or paycheck, but to the courage that keeps me moving forward even amid uncertainty. Where silence once broadened cavities of shame, dialogue, internal and external, brings the healing air of connection. If there is one enduring invitation that has emerged from this journey, it is to embrace the full spectrum of our financial and emotional experience with openness, to step into the vulnerability that accompanied shame without shrinking from it, to share our stories with those who listen without judgment, revealing ourselves as beautifully imperfect travelers navigating a landscape often marked by fear, but also by resilience. This is how we reclaim power, not by erasing our histories, but by transforming them through awareness and shared humanity. The path is not always comfortable. Sometimes it is winding and shadowed, demanding courage I didn't know I had. And yet, with each step, I feel my spirit grow sturdier, my perspective wider. What once seemed like an isolating struggle now unfolds as a deeply human endeavor, a collective dance toward freedom, dignity, and possibility. This is the gift of breaking silence. Not perfection, but a kind of grace that emerges when we dare to confront what we have long tried to hide. I carry that grace now, and it carries me forward.